From now on, we'll begin a session hosted by the Korean Institute for National Unification titled Measures for International Cooperation to Realize Sustainable Peace on the Korean Peninsula. The moderator is Mr. Chun Byung-gon, Senior Research Fellow at Korea Institute for National Unification. Over to you, Mr. Chun. Good afternoon. As introduced, my name is Chun Byung-gon from KINU, and I will moderate this session. The theme or the topic of this session is Measures for International Cooperation to Realize Sustainable Peace on the Korean Peninsula. We will be able to hear two presentations today. One is about the Korean Peninsula peace process amid the strategic conflict between U.S. and China. And another presentation is on the perception of overseas experts on Korea's public diplomacy. So these are the topics for the two presentations. So, of course, we have two presenters, Dr. Shin Jong-ho and Dr. Chae Won-gun. Allow me to briefly introduce them to you. Dr. Shin Jong-ho is a research fellow at the Korea Institute for National Unification. He received his PhD at Beijing University. He's a China expert. And his areas of research are U.S. China relations, South Korea-China relations. He has carried out some in-depth studies in relation to these areas. And he has also been active in the National Unification Advisory Council and the Unification Ministry. Next is Dr. Chae Won-gun, professor at Kyunghee University. So he received his PhD in political science at the University of Hawaii. And his area of focus are refugees, human rights, international development, cooperation, and so on. And in order to enrich the presentation of these two speakers, we have three discussants joining us today. Because we don't have much time, let me briefly introduce them to you. First, Mr. Nicholas Swanstrom, who is the director of the Institute for Security and Development Policy in Sweden. He is joining us online. I wonder if he can hear me. So, he received his PhD in Peace and Conflict Studies from Uppsala University. And his areas of focus are conflict prevention, conflict management, regional cooperation, Chinese foreign policy, and so on. And we hope to hear the perspective of someone from Europe with regards to matters on the Korean Peninsula. Next is Ms. Chae Ah-jin, professor at Yonsei University. So she studied in the U.S. She received her MA in political science at Yonsei and PhD at Duke University. And she's very active in the field of diplomacy and also academia. And last, we have Dr. Lee Gi-tae, research fellow at the Korean Institute for National Unification. In particular, he is the director of Peace Research Division. He received his PhD in political science from Keio University, so he's an expert in Japan. His main research area is Japanese security policy and international relations in East Asia. He has done many studies with regards to these fields. So that was my short introduction of the presenters and discussants. So allow me to briefly explain how we will proceed with this session. So we will first hear the two presentations, and then afterwards, our three discussants will make their remarks. And of course, we have our online participants from whom we will also receive questions and comments that we will address later. As for time allocation, I will give each presenter 15 to 20 minutes. So please do not go over 20 minutes. For the discussants, I will give you 7 to 8 minutes and maximum of 10 minutes. So please bear that time limit in mind. Then now we will begin the first presentation. Dr. Shin Jung-ho, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Shin Jong-ho of the Korea Institute for National Unification. I will be talking about the relation between China and the U.S. and the Korean peace process. It's a great honor for me to touch upon this topic, and I will try my best to deliver a good presentation. Today, as I mentioned earlier, I will be talking about the Korea peace process and the U.S. China strategic competition. Here you have an overview of my presentation. I will focus first on giving you some background. I will take a look at the international order and the changes in the international order. If you look at the international order, at center stage is the U.S. China strategic competition. Against this backdrop, so against the backdrop of U.S. China competition, I attempt to look at what impact this has on the Korean Peninsula. Of course, there are a lot of negative impacts, and however, I wish to highlight that there are some positive impacts that we can note. And then I will talk about some features of this competition. The nature of this competition must be understood for us to respond to this adequately. And third, I want to take a look at the strategic environment that we are placed in. I will take a look at North Korea, who is the other counterpart to the Korea Peace Initiative, and I will take a look at the changes in their strategies. And by taking a look at this, I will take a look at what terms and conditions need to be ripe in order for the Korea peace process to be restarted. So I will attempt to touch upon all these issues within the time allowed to me. In the Cold War era, we had a bipolar system of the Soviet Union and the U.S. At the time, many people believed that that was a very stable system because the enemy was very clear. And the Soviet Union and the U.S. Formed two polars, and there was a balance of power, and then there were a balance of power and nuclear might as well. So it was quite stable. In the post-Cold War era, there were no wars. However, we are now seeing a lot of conflict and confrontation all over the world. So including the Cold War period and the post-Cold War period, the Korean Peninsula has suffered from a lot of negative impact. That is what a lot of people think, especially in the Cold War period. As you can see in the center here, President Nixon visited China. And then the Soviet bloc came crumbling down, and this all impacted the Korean Peninsula. For instance, changes led to a Korean War, and due to the communist bloc collapsing, this led to some agreements and to the normalizing of ties with China on the part of South Korea. So what I want to point out is that there are negative impacts and positive impacts. In particular, the normalizing of relations with China on the part of South Korea was, I think, also has its positive sides. We can't say that it was all negative, that the impact was all negative. In the post-Cold War era, from the early 1990s to 2008, maintained a unipolar system. And then after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, it starts seeking cooperation with China. And then with 2008-2009's global financial crisis, and in 2009, China really emerged as the second largest economy, and it emerged as a superpower, and many people felt that China had actually caught up with the U.S. And the competition has been only increasing since the Obama administration. And you can see the competition between the U.S.'s Indo-Pacific strategy against China's One Belt, One Road initiative. And of course, in the Korean Peninsula, we had the 2002 Geneva Agreement, the four-party talks, the Korea-China FTA agreement, and then in 2018, there was a period of improvement of ties between the two Koreas. The 2000 Inter-Korean Summit and 2018 improvement of inter-Korean relations were actually a result of this international order. So, in the process of the U.S. and China warming up, we were able to hold the Inter-Korean Summit. I'm sure you have already forgotten, but even in 2018, the previous year, there was a very strong confrontational phase with the Trump administration, speaking about fire and fury, but the U.S. military exercises were delayed, and then Kim Jong-un made a New Year's address. And in 2017, 2018, U.S. China relations began later on. So we actually benefited from the competition between the U.S. and China. So that is my point here. So depending on how the two Koreas respond, the U.S.-China competition, despite the competition, we can still bring reconciliation and dialogue on the Korean Peninsula. If you look at China and the U.S., I don't think they are in a typical kind of struggle between two Koreas. I mean, the two powers. I think they are in a strategic competition relationship, and this is how the relationship expressed. So they are in a position where one is not significantly more powerful than the other. And so when people say that this is a new Cold War order, I do not fully agree, because we cannot explain everything that is going on with this logic. I think that we need to define the relationship between U.S. and China as strategic competitors. And this competition has been spurred because the national power of the two countries have become somewhat similar. Compared to the past, the U.S.'s power has declined somewhat, and China has risen as the second largest economy in the world, and it has started to recognize its own power compared to the U.S. And then historically, the two countries do have issues of trust and confidence. And also, China's interest and national interest has expanded to many parts of the globe, and the U.S. has responded to this, and that is what is accelerating this strategic competition. And I believe the trigger was probably COVID-19. Since COVID-19, China and the U.S. have been pointing the finger at each other. And if you look at the Pew Research Center survey, in the past, the U.S. People of the United States, Americans, were not especially favorable of China, but you can see that after the outbreak, a lot of people have unfavorable views about China, and in terms of the military as well. In the South China Sea, there were some acute confrontations. So the strategic competition between these two countries are shown not only in the trade area, but in military, in terms of the military and ideology. And this year in particular, with the inauguration of the Biden administration, a lot of people expected or hoped that they would take a different stance toward China. However, at the end of the day, in the process of focusing on national interest, we see that largely it remains similar. I think that this is shown in the withdrawal of the U.S. forces from Afghanistan. From the U.S. perspective, the withdrawal or the decision to withdraw has been raised since a few administrations ago. And there were demands by the people, and the government had to focus on economic growth. But if you look at it from the lens of Sino-U.S. relations, I think it was impacted by the need for the U.S. to focus on its China policy, to put pressure on it and to keep it in check. And China is opposed to U.S.'s withdrawal. They feel that the U.S. is being irresponsible of pulling out when the situation is not stable. But from China's perspective, if you look at its foreign policy, they seek stabilization of neighboring countries and neighboring regions. And this has been a policy stance that they have kept since the opening up of their country. Afghanistan and China share borders. And given China's domestic political scene and COVID-19, if there is instability there, they cannot focus on these domestic issues, and that is why China is opposed to the U.S. Withdrawing from Afghanistan. I think that the China policy of the Trump administration and the Biden administration are quite similar. I think they differ in other areas, but if you look at their China policies, it's largely similar. So I think that the Biden administration's China policy can be described as Trump's policies and plus alpha. So they continue to recognize China as a strategic competitor. And they are still keeping China in check, and they are still applying pressure, but they're doing it in a much more sophisticated manner. As to the China perception and policy of the Biden administration, I think they see it in three lenses: conflict, competition, and cooperation. Of course, the U.S., I think, is placing a lot of focus on competition. Of course, if you focus on conflict, this means that the U.S. will be negatively impacted as well, especially in trade and commerce. So I think that they're really trying to not escalate things when it comes to trade and commerce. And they say that China is a party to collaborate with and cooperate with when it comes to North Korean nuclear issue. But this is because, not because they believe that North Korean nuclear issue is important, but rather because they have to manage the North Korean nuclear issue as it is right now, because they have other more pertinent agenda that they have to tackle and issues that they have to tackle. That is my opinion. I think the climax of this competition was in June last year when the United States Innovation and Competition Act was passed at the Senate. This act outlines how the U.S. will innovate in the future and how it will compete with China and how it will overcome China in this competition. And 6 committees are part of this act. And you can see that there are many provisions that pertain to innovation within the U.S., but it also pertains to or includes provision on keeping China in check as well. And I think that this provides an important view into the stance that, or the position that the U.S. has against China. If you look at China, China plans to hold a party congress, and in January it has the Winter Olympics. So from the mid to long-term view, I think that China is willing to take this competition for the long haul. And China is focused on what is a double virtuous cycle. And so it is planning to respond to the U.S. by focusing on growing its domestic market. I think that this competition does impact East Asia in many ways, but I think it impacts it greatly, most significantly, because it is creating camps within East Asia. So the U.S. is placing importance on the alliance and the cooperation in terms of security and the Quad Plus countries, and they are preparing to hold a summit for democracy. On the other hand, China, in terms of its competition, is responding by placing emphasis on cooperation with North Korea and Russia. They renewed the alliance with North Korea, and they are enhancing cooperation with the Eastern and European countries, and also with Iran. So although it is not exactly the same or a duplicate of the Cold War era, you can see that there are two camps, and U.S. and China are trying to attract more allies, if you will, in its different camps. I will briefly touch upon the strategy changes in North Korea. So then what is North Korea's position? I think North Korea has made a very important decision, which I hope to highlight, and I will skip over the rest. In 2016, Kim Jong-un announced that North Korea will pursue a parallel track of nuclear armament and economic growth. And then they prepare for the Panmunjom summit in April 2018. And during the third plenary session, Kim Jong-un talks about focusing solely on building the economy. And I think that this was Kim Jong-un's way of saying that North Korea was willing to open and reform its economy. In China in 1978, the party held a Central Committee meeting, and they announced the open and reform policy. At the time, Deng Xiaoping did not use open and reform in that way. He said that China will focus fully on growing its economy, and now we call that open and reform. So I think that before and after 2018, we are seeing signs of a shift in the North Korean strategy, and this is impacting all the relations that pertain to North Korea. And so North Korea, it has to reestablish its relations with China and the U.S. and South Korea. And then after the Hanoi summit fell apart, and then in 2020, North Korea faced many difficulties, as you can see outlined here, the COVID and natural disasters. So North Korea is actually having difficulties following through on this strategy. That is why earlier this year, North Korea announced its policy of self-reliance. Self-reliance was something that was campaigned for in the past. And they usually turn to self-reliance when the external environment is dire, when they are isolated. And so it seems that North Korea feels that it is not in a good spot to cooperate internationally. So it is demanding that the U.S. withdraw its hostility policy. So I think that North Korea will not respond if the U.S. proposes anything but the withdrawal of hostile policy. And you can see that North Korea is also focusing on its relation with China. And I think that this shows that the North Korea will not respond to U.S. calls if it does not withdraw its hostile policy. And this is a detailed table of the Biden administration's North Korea policy, but North Korea has not responded to this yet. And this is probably because North Korea is skeptical of the U.S. position. And in particular, the U.S. has not responded to and has not covered the demand on the North Korean part to withdraw hostile policies. So from the perspective of North Korea, if anything the U.S. puts on the table is not related to withdrawing its hostile policy, it's highly unlikely that North Korea will respond. But I also feel that the U.S. will not significantly change its stance on North Korea either. And lastly, what can we do to restart the Korean peace process? I think these are the terms and conditions. I think what is most important is to understand the nature of the strategic competition between the U.S. and China. And the first is that this is going to be protracted. this is not a competition that is going to be over soon. The likelihood that the U.S. will suddenly get significantly ahead of China is unlikely, and the vice versa is unlikely as well. So I think that for at least a decade, the U.S. and China will cooperate with each other and compete with each other in certain sections. So amid this backdrop, when something happens, I think what's important is for South Korea to not waver, to stand its ground and be consistent. And we also need a more complicated or complex response. We cannot look at issues solely from a military perspective or an economical perspective. So if you look at the Quad 4 arrangement, it's not simply a military arrangement or a conflict or confrontational arrangement. It's very much more complicated than that. So we can't put these issues in silos and try to brand them and deal with them separately. And now, as for my conclusion, one of the conditions that need to be right to restart the Korean peace process also has to do with certain values that we hold near and dear, democracy and peace. And I think that this really needs to be fully reflected in Korea's foreign policy. And when it comes to the inter-Korean cooperation, I think when it's difficult for the central government to take the lead, then we other entities, smaller entities, need to take the lead with North Korea demands in mind. And I also think that DPRK-U.S. relations are very important. The core of U.S. China policy is impacted and in relation to its DPRK policy. And so I think we need to make diverse efforts to normalize relations between the U.S. and the DPRK. And I think we need to decide on how much cooperation we need from China. So how are we going to define China's role is also important. I think the key word in the Korea peace process is peace. We have to think about how we're going to reach a consensus about peace regarding neighboring countries, and internally, what kind of efforts are we going to make in order to achieve peace? And so we need a consensus both at home and abroad, and I think a very important piece of this puzzle is public diplomacy. So in order to restart the Korea peace process, I think that these are some of the conditions that have to be met. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm sorry for not being able to give you more time, but perhaps during the Q&A and discussion time, you will be given more time to add more thoughts.
He talked about the U.S. China strategic competition in light of the international order. And he talked about the strategic changes in North Korea, the political situation in South Korea. And he also talked about some conditions that need to be met in order to restart the Korea peace process. And he also highlighted the fact that we needed a more multifaceted response. We will dive into more detail later on, perhaps during the discussion portion of our session. And with that, I would like to invite the next speaker.
Dr. Che, if you would, please. Good afternoon. Today, I would like to talk about South Korea's public diplomacy on peace and unification, perceptions and prospects. My name is Choi Won-gun, and I'm a research professor at Kyunghee University. Actually, this was a joint research that was carried out by Kyunghee University as well as the Korea Global Forum for Peace. And now let me dive into my presentation. So, I would like to first talk about some background theories on the Korean public diplomacy on peace and unification. So Joseph Nye came up with the concept of soft power, which is being used in diplomacy by a lot of countries these days. So a simple definition of a soft power is that you would have the other person to be led voluntarily to get the outcome that you want through attraction rather than coercion. So here in Korea, with regards to public diplomacy, which is based on soft power, it announced 2010 as the first year of its public diplomacy. And since then, it has carried out public diplomacy activities. And since 2010, even in its unification diplomacy, South Korea has harnessed soft power to provide information to people of other countries about the reunification so as to create a consensus among themselves with regards to unification. But we are interested in looking at how peace can never be separated from unification. So we want to look at what is called the public diplomacy on peace and unification. And we also need to take a look at what's going on at the present moment to draw up a picture for the future. And from 2012 to 2013, we conducted a research which was titled The Implementation Strategy for Korean Peninsula Public Diplomacy on Unification. So it's been 10 years since the public diplomacy has been harnessed in Korea, and actually this research is again ongoing. We have resumed the research and we have now tried to find out where Korea's public diplomacy stands today. So we wanted to see the state status and the effectiveness and direction of public diplomacy on peace and unification. So we conducted a survey on people who are Korean Peninsula experts in Korea in 4 neighboring countries, which are the U.S, Japan, China, and Russia. And the respondents are not only from the academia, but also government and public sector and civil society, like the press, NGO, businesses, and culture, and so on. And we conducted a survey, as I explained, and what's really notable about this survey is that we have come up with 5 analytic frameworks of public policy. So basically, the survey is divided into 5 parts, which greatly helped us in structuring this survey. So we did run into some difficulties. There were geographical limitations, and limitations also posed by the fact that this was an online survey, because there were some connection issues with regards to people from different countries, and there were the problems of translation. And we also had to take into consideration of the political sensitivity of some countries. So in case of China, it's been 100 years since the Communist Party was formed, so there is that political background. And this survey is rather sensitive for China at this moment in time. So it was very difficult for us to proceed with the survey with regards to the Chinese participants. So we had about 68 respondents. And actually, contrary to our expectation, we did not see much participation from those from the United States and China. Nevertheless, we've seen some active participation from those in Japan, Russia, and also South Korea. Most of them were in their 40s and 50s, and they've had between 10 to 20 years of field experience. So this is a survey on experts on Korean Peninsula. So our respondents were those that we wanted. They were the precise targets that we wanted. So now let me share the survey findings and our analysis. So actually, the analysis of the survey findings is still ongoing. So I would not be able to provide an in-depth analysis for you today. But let me just show you some significant items that we identified from the survey. So first of all, the overall assessment on the public diplomacy on peace and unification. So with regards to public diplomacy on unification, there were more of negative responses standing at 37% instead of positive responses at 29%. But with regards to public diplomacy on peace and its effectiveness, we actually saw more positive responses. However, the two questions also had the most number of respondents answering neutral when it comes to the efficiency of the two types of public diplomacy. So we can see that from the viewpoint of experts, our public diplomacy on unification and peace still has a long way to go. But what is really interesting is that on the questions of the effectiveness of public diplomacy on unification and also on peace, there were very different responses depending on the country. So with regards to U.S. and China, you can see that China's respondents responded very positively on the effectiveness of public diplomacy on unification, where the U.S. answered very negatively. And also, that's the case of Japan. U.S. and Japan are usually considered as our traditional allies, but most of these respondents from the United States and China said public diplomacy on peace and unification is not being carried out effectively. And while analyzing the survey findings, we were surprised at the fact that we could divide the response into two categories, as in the U.S. and Japan mostly answered a negative, whereas China and Russia mostly answered positive on the effectiveness of the public diplomacy. And also public diplomacy on peace and on unification. So those were some striking findings of this survey. And next, we also asked some questions with regards to perceptions of public diplomacy on unification. So these are just more detailed questions about the effectiveness of diplomacy on unification. So we gave them some sentences with regards to their perception of public diplomacy on unification and asked them to answer on a scale of 1 to 5, strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, and strongly disagree. With regards to the answers on South Korea's public diplomacy and unification makes effective use of various resources. There were a lot of positive responses. But with regards to whether its public diplomacy and unification has helped people of other countries to recognize the importance of unification, or that it contributed in encouraging other people to support unification, there were a lot of negative responses. So with regards to public diplomacy on unification, instilling this positive image of unification on people outside of Korea, many experts answer that is not the case. And what we can see from these items is that experts in the United States and Japan, usually most of them answered disagree or strongly disagree. But China and Russia mostly answered strongly agree and agree. So these were some notable characteristics that we found throughout the survey. Now, we asked the same questions on to the experts with regards to the public diplomacy on peace this time. And this time, on 4 items, we received many positive answers. But the last item, whether South Korea's public diplomacy on peace on the Korean Peninsula has contributed in encouraging people of other countries to support unification, you can see that we mostly received negative responses. So here again, China and Russia responded very positively with regards to Korea's public diplomacy on peace, whereas the United States and Japan mostly answered negative. So they still have a negative perception with regards to the effectiveness of Korea's public diplomacy on peace. Now, we also have to talk about the goal of public diplomacy, and our survey included questions regarding that. When asked on what is the goal of public diplomacy on unification, Many people answered enhancing peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula and the promoting the need to resolve North Korea nuclear issue at 41% and 26%. So, but this is a public diplomacy on unification. But with regards to promoting the need for peace, that answer stood only at 12%. So this was a very interesting survey outcome. And with regards to that question, if we are to divide the responses by each country, Korea, Japan, and the United States said that the goal of the public diplomacy on unification is to enhance peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula and so on. But the United States and China said that also it needs to promote the need to resolve North Korean nuclear issue. And with regards to public diplomacy on peace on the Korean Peninsula and its goal, most people answered that it prevents war through the maintenance of a ceasefire state. In other words, a peaceful coexistence. And we can also see these differing opinions country to country. So as you can see, with regards to the responses, they're mostly we mostly got same percentages or similar ratio for each of the items.
유사한 패턴을 보이고 있는데 평화 공존, 군비 축소, 평화 협정 등 일단 현상 유지 내지는 세속적인 변화를 추구하는 답변을 좀 더 많이 했고.
And when asked about the goal of the Korean Peninsula's public diplomacy on peace, and you can see that the United States for about 25% and for Japan about 35% answered that it's preventing war through the maintenance of a ceasefire state, whereas you can see from second to the right, the column, many of the respondents from all the countries said it's about creating permanent peace in neighboring countries and establishing a joint security regime. And with regards to creating permanent peace in neighboring countries and establishing a joint security regime, like I said before, a high percentage of them say that this ought to be the goal of public diplomacy of peace. So many experts, this shows us that many experts view our public diplomacy as being directly linked to regional peace. So let me now talk about the subjects of public diplomacy. So as you can see, most of the survey respondents said the government is the one that leads the public diplomacy on peace, whereas which is followed by 25 or 26% of them saying that it is the public sector and private sector together that leads our public diplomacy on peace and also on unification. So this really shows us that the civil sector does not seem to play an active role, at least in the eyes of the experts. So we need to think about ways to encourage civil participation going forward. And let's talk about the medium or the carrier and also resources and assets of public diplomacy. So newspapers and broadcasts and also these can be called the new old media, and there are also the new media like the internet and social network, and also there are PR materials and booklets and so on. So these were the top 3 mediums that the experts perceived. But what's really interesting is that the effective medium as viewed by the experts on public diplomacy for peace is mostly internet and social media, the new media. So it is very important that we would be able to make use of these more private sector means like internet and social network to promote public diplomacy on peace, whereas in the traditional way we used to use booklets by governments, published by the government and so on. And in promoting peace on the Korean Peninsula, emphasizing the role of civil sector is very important, as well as education would also play a vital role. With regards to effective resources for public diplomacy on peace, many people answer that it's about interdependency through the facilitation of inter-Korean economic cooperation, as well as peace-oriented foreign policy. And what's really interesting is that Japan actually, most of Japanese experts answered that it is raising consensus through people-to-people exchanges, which stood at 29%. So that was very interesting once again. Now let's take a look at the challenges and prospects. So then what could be the obstacle to public diplomacy on unification? Many experts answer that it's North Korea's nuclear issue and mistrust between the two Koreas. They are very similar, as you can see, at 27% and 30%, and which is followed by concerns of the neighboring countries at 21%. But if we see this for each country, U.S., Japan, and Korea similarly answer that the biggest obstacles are concerns of neighboring countries and North Korea's nuclear issue. But China, 73% answer that it's the mistrust between the two Koreas, whereas Russia, 43% of them said it's mistrust between North and South Korea, and also 14% said that it's the rejection of unification by people in both countries. So this was a very interesting finding. If you look at the responses of China and Russia experts, so the United States, Japan, and South Korea usually look at the surrounding landscape when considering the obstacles for public diplomacy on unification. But China and Russia views this obstacle as being a bilateral problem between North and South Korea. With regards to obstacles on public diplomacy on peace, many of the respondents answer that it's North Korean nuclear issue and also inconsistent policy by the South Korean government. So with regards to the South Korean government's inconsistent policy, its government switches from the conservative to liberal to conservative, and so on and so forth. It goes back and forth, which means that the policy on North Korea keeps on changing, and that lowers the level of confidence of other countries and Korea's public diplomacy on peace. So as you can see, once again, whereas the U.S. and Japan and Korea are of the same opinion or similar opinion that it's about North Korean nuclear issues and U.S.-ROC alliance, China actually said that it is South Korea's inconsistent policy that is the biggest obstacle to public diplomacy on peace. And Russia too, it has 27% answer that it's the inconsistent policy. But what's really also interesting is that 20% of Russian respondents also said it's about the hostility and the impetuousness of North Korean leadership. So with regards to the direction that the unification public diplomacy should seek after, most of them said that it should be about enhancing peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, which posed a lot of insight for us. And with regards to the direction that should be pursued, with regards to the public diplomacy on peace, most of them at 20% said it's the denuclearization of Korean Peninsula. But as you can see, the proportion of the answers are pretty much the same. So if we were to just summarize the overview of our public diplomacy on unification and peace, it seems that the experts are of the opinion that there has not been a substantial outcome to date it has not been able to promote unification and instilling motivation within people that we need unification. But then with regards to the peace public diplomacy, it did share some expectations that we will be able to create a peace and settle everlasting peace on Northeast Asia. But we could see that as to how we achieve peace on the peninsula, the United States and Japan emphasize more on creating a peace regime, whereas China and Russia emphasize the goal of unifying the two Koreas. So there are some differences. And with regards to our subjects and medium, there are some really two important elements out of the 5 elements that I answered. With regards to our subject, like I said before, we need to enhance or increase the participation of the civil sector. And with regards to media, we need to make a greater use of the new media, as I mentioned earlier. And if we look at the task and the prospect of our public diplomacy on peace and unification, U.S., Japan, and Korea, and also China and Russia, these two groups have very different views with regards to obstacles of our public diplomacy. U.S., Japan, and Korea said it's about North Korean nuclear issue, whereas China and Russia said it's the inter-Korean relations. So with regards to our future direction, I think the survey told us that we need to emphasize that public diplomacy and unification would bring peace in not only the Korean Peninsula but Northeast Asia. And with regards to public diplomacy and unification, I think going forward we need to emphasize that we need to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula and so on. So thank you for the presentation, Dr. Cho. So you talked about ways in which we could go beyond the existing public diplomacy. And to do so, you conducted a survey on experts of Korean Peninsula matters, and you did say that the analysis is still ongoing. But I'm sure that you'll be able to identify many political implications from this survey. And through our discussion portion of this session, perhaps you could get some helpful inputs that would help you in doing further analysis of the outcome. So now let's go into discussion. So we will first hear from Dr. Nicholas Swanstrom, and I will give each discussant about 7 to 8 minutes and maximum of 10 minutes. Please do not go over 10 minutes. Then Dr. Swanstrom, please.
Well, thank you very much, sir. First of all, thanks to the organizers for inviting me, and of course, thanks to the presenters and all the other participants. I'll try to be very short. I mean, it's been 2 very interesting papers, and let me start with the last paper that was Professor Wong-Gyun Choi. I think it's very interesting. It's always relevant to have this very sort of consistent and statistical overview. What strikes me really is one relationship. I mean, I think the overview of the nationalities is very interesting. But I would also like to see what are the differences between academics, government officials, NGOs. Because my experience is, for example, that government officials tend to be slightly different than the NGOs. And me as an academic might have one view, but then government officials are different. And I find it's really interesting to listen to hear that you had problems getting a bit of the Chinese participation, and if I understood it correctly, the American participation. The Chinese I can understand, because if they don't agree to the government, they might not want to speak out. But the U.S. would be extremely interesting if you can sort of extrapolate on what that could be and how we see that. What I also had thought about. I mean, it was really interesting to see, as you said yourself, the rather negative view of South Korean allies, Japan and the United States and all that. My first reaction is that, why? Is that expectations? Is it that United States and Japan have higher expectations on South Korea? That they feel that the South Koreans should be able to accomplish more? And for example, the Chinese and Russians are quite happy with South Korea accomplishing maybe less. So my first reaction was really, is this a political reaction, or is it sort of a true reaction from academics? So for this, I mean, that goes in line with the South Korean inconsistent policy. Well, it's a terrible thing to be a democracy. We change government on a regular basis. And of course, we get a lot of criticism from China and other non-democracies for not having consistent policy. But that argument for me is primarily political. It's not really necessarily connected to it. And then just a final comment. What I think would be extremely relevant is to include North Korea. And I know that the South Koreans are saying, well, that's impossible. Well, in my experience, it's not really at all. The North Koreans has been very forthcoming when it comes to collaboration and answering questions. Even during the pandemic, I found it not easy because they can't travel and we can't travel there, but there are other ways of communication. So I think that the next step on this extremely interesting study would be try to get more North Korean participation. And if you can't do that directly, I think you can use proxies. Just a few comments then on the next paper, Professor Shin's paper. And actually, when I say proxy, one thing I sort of turn against, and I agree with the paper completely almost, is really the post-Cold War as a rather stable and peaceful. The proxy conflicts. There's been a number of proxy conflicts during the whole Cold War. Iran 46, Algerian War, the Congos in 60, 65, etc. And my question is really, will we see a similar thing now? Will we see a United States and China engaging in proxy conflicts? Taiwan, of course, is the most obvious example that comes up. I think I read it today, but I think they came out yesterday that now is a majority of American population who wants to defend Taiwan against the Chinese invasion. So that's the highest number so far. So for me, it's sort of, what can we expect here? So that's something that comes up as a problem. Then I think the nature of the tension between China and United States, or between China and the world, I think one of your graphs showed that quite clearly, that the Chinese perception of China declined already in 2011. Then it went slightly up in 2017 to drop again. I think it's broader than the COVID. It's broader than simply strategic competition. It's also an ideological competition. It's an economic competition. And I think we see it similarly. I mean, take my own country, Sweden, as an example. We have the third lowest or worst perception of China in the world. Japan, Germany has the worst than we have, and then is Sweden. And that goes hand in hand with the Chinese wolf warrior diplomacy. And of course, the abduction of a Swedish citizen, pressure on academics, pressure on media, etc. So what we see is a very different China. And I think it's not only the sort of strategic tension that we're looking at something much broader. And I would just love to have your input on that, because I think it's a bit of simplification to just call it strategic. Then this is a challenge I see, to be honest. I mean, I think I agree with you. It's extremely difficult to move forward. I think partly because North Korea is not interested in moving forward, because North Korea actually benefits from the current situation. When great powers and the international community is divided, they have a lot of maneuver space. When we are engaged and when we are on the same page, and we saw that actually in the Olympics in South Korea, the international community was very sort of on the same page, and it was possible to push North Korea in the direction. We are not there yet. And I think we're going to take a long, long time before we can get to the same position. Then and you mentioned the different camps in East Asia. My question then, of course, is, can we build a regional structure? Can we build a regional framework that we could engage North Korea? I'm not very positive myself, but I think it's the only way, but I can't really see ways forward to do that. And I have many, many more questions, but I see in my clock here that I have 8.5 minutes. So I will stop here, but maybe I will get an opportunity to ask more questions during the time. So thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 두 개의 발표문에 대해서 골고루
on the two presentations. And you also gave us some relevant questions. So I hope that the two presenters will be able to address them later. And if we do have more time later, we will give Dr. Swanstrom a chance to speak more. Then now we would like to hear from Professor Choi Jin. Hello, my name is Choi Jin from Yonsei University. Thank you for inviting me to this great session. So I enjoyed the two presentations. So now first over to Dr. Shin.
Dr. Shin, in the initial part of his presentation, talked about the need to clearly identify the nature of China-U.S. relations. I completely agree with you on that point. And towards the end, you talk about how after that we can propose some policies going forward, and you actually did make some proposals. When we talk about U.S. and China relations, I think we can take two approaches. First is the approach that puts the emphasis on the conflict, and the second is the approach that places a focus on competition. So those who focus on conflict are thinking of the conflict for hegemony. And historically, these people feel that U.S. China could be engaged in such a competition. And people in this camp usually think about the possibility of war. I think Dr. Shin and other academics like John Miller believe that war between superpowers is no longer an effective policy in this day and age. And they are wary against exaggerated threat. They believe that exaggerated threat actually promotes or the possibility of war. So this camp actually focuses their analysis on the competition between the two powers. And I think that you were trying to focus that their relationship is one of competition, and I agree with you. However, I do differ with you in that I feel that the U.S.-China competition will have a different outcome. Dr. Shin was talking about how their competition will lead to establishing two different camps and solidifying those camps later on. But I believe that in the initial stages of this competition, the U.S. and China may try to build their own camps. However, this competition is not going to be over soon, and it's going to become very long-term and protracted. Given that, I don't think that the camps will be able to be solidified and maintained. So if you look at U.S. and Soviet Union, we keep going back to that, but I think that U.S. and China relations are different, and you did mention that. I think U.S.-China relations are very complicated and complex. However, the U.S. and Soviet Union relationship was very clear. It was the East against the West. And in the U.S.-China relation, they're so much more complicated because they actually have a lot of trade and economic ties. So it's almost impossible, I think, to divide them into two camps, if you will. And you have the countries that are kind of stuck in between. And I think that the status and the role of these countries have become different as well. And so these countries, instead of choosing sides, I believe will play the role of a facilitator between these two countries. And even if you see the international organizations, some international agencies are part of both camps, if you will. And so China and the U.S. might try to establish their own camps, but I don't think they'll be able to maintain them in this day and age. And the U.S. and China have dealt with a lot of global issues, and I think that the two realize that they need to cooperate. Recently, China and U.S. High-level officials held a meeting, and there is a plethora of issues that they need to deal with, Afghanistan, among others. And so I think they are already cooperating with each other. So the U.S.-China competition, I think, will be very different from the U.S.-Soviet Union competition, and the outcome as a result will be different. If you look at U.S.'s foreign policy recently, we see a new variable emerge, and that is the withdrawal of American forces from Afghanistan. If Afghanistan becomes a stable country, then the U.S. can focus on China and it will be able to focus on North Korea. However, if instability continues in Afghanistan, I think that will detract the U.S. From focusing on these two areas, and the priorities for the U.S. in terms of its foreign policy will change. So Dr. Shin also talked about the Korean peace process, and he talked about the conditions that needed to be met, and he talked about the external and internal situation and conditions. So the two Koreas at this point are at a stalemate. And I think perhaps we need to consider what we can do first. I think we can think about, for instance, a bipartisan effort to create a consensus regarding the Korean peace process. Of course, this is going to be difficult given that the presidential election is next year. And there is a high likelihood that the two ruling party and the opposition parties will highlight their differences ahead of the election. And of course, then the sustainability of the peace process itself could be raised. And if the sustainability is questioned inside, it will also have a negative impact on how neighboring countries think about the process as well. So what we need right now is a way to garner consensus regarding the Korea peace process. And in terms of the external environment, we need to build confidence with the U.S., and we also need to play the role of promoting a cooperative relationship between the U.S. and China. That could be our diplomatic role. And in terms of the relationship with Japan, I think that we need to develop a model, something like the six-party talks, a multilateral dialogue forum as well.
And next, with regards to the presentation made by Professor Che, so you talked about the public diplomacy of North Korea, and you asked experts from 5 different countries about their perception on the public diplomacy. But the importance of public diplomacy on peace and unification is increasing these days, so which makes your research all the more meaningful. And because this is inconsistent with the similar research that was conducted from 2012 to 2030, I think this would have a great academic implication for us researchers. What's really noteworthy in this outcome is the negative perceptions of Japan and U.S. and positive perceptions of China and Russia. But if we think about the efforts and budgets that went into public diplomacy, it should be the U.S. and Japan who have positive perceptions, but the research findings were very ironic. So our public diplomacy has a lot of room for improvement. And as you mentioned earlier, so between there is a similar assessment with Japan and the United States and also in China and Russia. So maybe in the process of answering these so can you kind of elaborate on that? And with regards to your need for raising the participation of civil society or private sector, I believe that this survey should be conducted not only on experts but on general public as well, because the survey itself can be a promotion of our public diplomacy to the public in other countries. And peace and unification, their concepts and definition have not been yet concretely established even amongst ourselves. So I think the survey could play a role in doing that. That's its future task going forward. And lastly, when we look at the findings of the survey, what are the political implications? What do we need to prioritize in order for that to help our public diplomacy? I'm sorry, not political implications, but policy implications. Yeah, so can you address some of those questions? Thank you very much. So you raised some very thought-provoking and wonderful questions, and almost in a given amount of time. I'm sure the two presenters can take those questions and comments as a great reference to boost their research further. Now, lastly, Mr. Lee, please.
Good afternoon. I am Igita, Director of the Korea Institute for National Unification. We are the sponsor of this session, and it's a great honor to host this session. Actually, I have comments for Dr. Choi, and then towards the end of my comments, I will offer some comments for Dr. Shin. And I do have some questions for Dr. Shin as well.
So first of all, Dr. Choi talked about public diplomacy on peace and unification, and the findings were very interesting. So as stated by Professor Choi already, these surveys can actually be conducted not only on experts but also the general public of those in other countries, so as to promote Korea and to raise their understanding and awareness of peace and unification on the Korean Peninsula. So a survey like this is actually a great item of public diplomacy, I believe. And with regards to this terminology, public diplomacy on peace and public diplomacy on unification, they are not yet generalized. So I'm sure you have a lot of concerns about how to word this. Actually, back in the days, we used to conduct related researches on public diplomacy and peace and so on. And Mr. Shin also, towards the end of his presentation, really emphasized the importance of public diplomacy and peace and public diplomacy and unification. But how do we go about integrating them is something that we also need to talk about, because rather than unification, actually peace should be established first, and then ultimately we would pursue unification. I think that was the gist of our public diplomacy on peace and unification. When we look at the findings, the impression that I got is that this public diplomacy on peace and on unification would have to be converged or integrated in a very effective manner going forward. So we did see a very interesting result. So Japan, United States, Japan, United States, and South Korea on one hand, and China responding on the other hand. These two parties, I guess you can say, gave very different responses, especially with regards to public diplomacy and peace and unification. They were very split on their opinions. So whether it be a public diplomacy and peace and unification, separating them, I think you really need to integrate them. And by integrating them, we should really come up with some customized ways of designing this public diplomacy so that it could be customized to be appropriate for each country. I'm a Japanese expert, so I was very interested in Japan's response. And what was really interesting is that Japan actually thinks very positively on building peace and unification. And the public diplomacy regarding that, I thought that was very puzzling, kind of, because what Japanese experts are talking about these days is that talking about public diplomacy on peace and unification to people in Japan might actually deteriorate the people's perception about the unification, the co-prosperity on the region and the peninsula, and so on. So, the Japanese scholars actually say that perhaps public diplomacy on peace and unification is not so effective overall, actually in Japan at least. But when I saw that the survey respondents said that they believe public diplomacy on peace and unification is very effective, it's very different from what my colleagues in Japan say. So I thought that was very interesting. And when doing public diplomacy on peace and unification in Japan, I think peace is very effective. Japan is the only country that was hit by atomic bombs. And therefore, they are very interested in peace. They have this identity centered on peace. So, public diplomacy on peace is something that we need to emphasize with regards to the Japanese public. But thankfully, we can see from the survey that the Japanese experts think very positive on the effectiveness of public diplomacy on peace. So, we can go ahead and pursue that in Japan further down the road. And with regards to the outcome of public diplomacy, most of the survey respondents said that overall it was not very effective, that Korea's public diplomacy was not very effective, even though Korea has conducted public diplomacy for a long time, led by the government. And maybe this government-led scheme might have been the limiting factors. We could have made more use of the private sector and also the new media and the assets and mediums that this private sector has, as Dr. Chen mentioned. And of course, there might have been some discord in terms of policy decision making when it comes to public diplomacy here in South Korea. So perhaps the Ministry of Unification can play a greater role, a more active role in pursuing public diplomacy on peace and unification, and how we can garner support from the private sector. And when taking Japan as an example, us conducting public diplomacy on Japan, let's say, I think some people say that this might be unrealistic because our policies and our public diplomacies are not consistent, especially when it comes to Japan. So Japan-Korea relations is deteriorating, but we are emphasizing public diplomacy, the importance of peace and unification in Japan. So is this really going to be effective? So like I said, we need to make sure that these public diplomacies are customized.
Dr. Shin, thank you for your presentation. You talked about the strategic competition between U.S. and China. Comparing the Trump administration to the Biden administration, you talked about how the Biden administration's China policy is Trump plus alpha, and I have to agree. If you look at the competition between U.S. and China, there is a geopolitical component. And against that backdrop, lately, There is the economic security and technological hegemony, and so we need to look at the strategic competition from these two perspectives as well. And you also touched upon the Korea peace process. From a geopolitical perspective, I think that the U.S. China strategic competition does impact inter-Korean relations and the Korea peace process. For instance, under North Korean sanctions, there are import and export controls, and there are suspicions that technology and some items are being fed into North Korea by China. And so I think that from the economic security perspective and the geopolitical perspective, we can link the U.S. China strategic competition and the Korea peace process. And lastly, in terms of cooperative diplomacy and public diplomacy, I think the ultimate goal, of course, is to have amicable relations with all countries. But as you know, I am a Japanese expert, so I have to talk about Korea-Japan relations. And I think that improving Korea-Japan relations is something that we need to carry out urgently. And especially in the process of the Korea peace process, we cannot afford not to have Japan on our side. Recently, we have seen the Indo-Pacific strategy, and Europe is also interested in the Indo-Pacific area. And this is a new international order, if you will. If Europe takes part in this region, what is the future direction for Korea's diplomacy in the broader context? So I would like to love to hear your thoughts on this issue as well. Thank you very much. And we have heard the comments of all three discussants. There were some very poignant questions that were raised. I would now like to hand over the mic to the presenters to respond to the comments by the discussants. And as you get ready, let me just check if we have any questions that were posted from our online participants. We do not have any questions from any participants online. Do we have any questions from the floor? No? In that case, I would like to ask Dr. Nicholas Swanstrom to add to his comments, since you wanted to add to your comments earlier on. So I will give you some time and then allow the presenters to respond. Would you like to do that, sir?
Well, I think part of my question was already asked. Europe. I mean, since we have a stalemate between United States and China, and that is that relationship seems to be blocked for, I think it was mentioned, a decade, but nobody knows how long. Would it be possible to see other coalitions supporting both South Korea's public diplomacy, the peace process on the Korean Peninsula, such as Europe, but also India, other constellations? Is that possible to look at? And because, of course, as a European, I hope there is a space for Europe. We don't have a geopolitical interest necessarily, but we definitely we had a couple of difficult decades in the 30s and 40s that we do not want to repeat. And yeah, I'll stop there and I'll let them. I think they have enough questions for all of us.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you. So it seems that there are still a lot of tasks that lie ahead of us that requires further research. Now we will begin with Dr. Shin. We will give you about 3 to 4 minutes to respond to the questions and comments. So please.
Thank you. I think I have a lot of food for thought moving forward with this paper. I would like to first respond to Dr. Swanstrom's comments and questions. I think I have to ask you a favor first. When it comes to U.S. China relations, we are carrying out a survey about U.S. China relations that includes experts abroad. And so if I send you the survey, will you, sir, kindly respond to the survey and take part? Yes, thank you very much. I will make sure to send you that survey. You were talking about proxy conflict or proxy war. Last year, U.S. and China were in a conflict or in competition in other areas. And what we did was we categorized this into post-Cold War era and Cold War era. And one of the biggest characteristics of the Cold War era were proxy conflicts and proxy wars. And you asked if you think it's possible that this could happen in this day and age, and I think the answer to that is yes. However, when it comes to the scope of those conflicts, I think they would be different, but I still think that it is a possibility. And the China policy toward the U.S.'s China policy has shifted since 2011. It's a bit more pessimistic. In 2008 to 2009, China really emerged as a superpower, and China's U.S. policy, actually, I believe, shifted to a slightly more aggressive stance starting in 2010 with the Google incident. And this led to changing perceptions in the U.S. among Americans. And then the Obama administration introduced the pivot to Asia policy. And I think that's the time when the perception regarding China started to deteriorate quite rapidly. And that has been maintained until this day. I think that a lot of the outside perception has turned sour. I think in the past, China didn't really recognize itself as a superpower. So if it was more humble, if you were. But since 2008, it started to recognize that it is indeed a superpower. And if you look at the issues that China needs to resolve, I think one of the biggest issues will be for China on how to overcome those perceptions. And also, Dr. Che, I think some of the issues that you raised, I really have to think hard about as well. I have a term or phrase that I use quite often. We need, from a realistic perspective, U.S.-China cooperation seems smaller than U.S.-China conflict. But from a liberalistic point of view, if you look at the situation that the U.S. and China are in, there is great possibility for cooperation. But at this stage, at this phase, if we were to look ahead 5 to 10 years, I would say that it is a confrontational phase, but it is more like a pre-confrontational phase. And so when a confrontational event occurs, the two countries are preparing for that period, if you will. And you were talking about camps, how camps might be established in the region. I think I mentioned in my presentation that it will be slightly different from the Soviet Union era. I don't necessarily want to use the word camps. Perhaps spheres of influence might be a better expression. So if the U.S. can wield influence in some areas, perhaps China will not care that much. But in the current situation, the U.S. or China do not have a lot of wielding power in any one particular region. And so they will try to increase their sphere of influence. As Dr. Swanstrom mentioned in his last comments, from Korea's perspective, this kind of camp diplomacy or this battle for influence, this is something that we need to move away from. And in order for Korea to do that, we need to really place importance on our relation with neighboring relations. In a study that we carried out last year, in the Cold War era, India and other countries really placed importance on their neighbors, and they overcome the crisis. And in the post-Cold War process, Germany and the UK also sought balance in their relationship to overcome the crisis then. And so this is not an issue that can only be applied to U.S. and China. I think if you look at the broader ASEAN or Europe region, we need to express our willingness and capability to resolve issues in this era to these European and other countries as well.
Okay. Let me first answer to the questions to Dr. Swanstrom. First of all, thank you for sharing your thoughts and really important questions and comments for my study. For the answer to your first question about differences between the academia, government officers, and NGOs, well, it's very important, but unfortunately, I haven't touched the topic yet. It's an ongoing study, so I'm in the middle of the pathway. But I know I totally agree that it's extremely
그러나
important
제가
to find the
박사님과
differences
동의하는
and,
것은
shared a kind of thoughts between those different groups. So I will definitely add that part in the final report, and I will hopefully, if you want, share a report with you in the near future. Okay, and the participant from China and the U.S. were kind of a really extremely frustrating and concerning topic in this study. Yeah, we tried really hard to recruit many participants from China, but we couldn't really successfully did it. But also the U.S. the lower participant rate from the U.S. Academics and especially the government officers were really frustrating. And on top of the negative responses to the Korean public diplomacy on peace and unification. Well, I have a couple of thoughts, but it's too concerning and really frustrating. So really hard. Careful to share it, but the lower response rate maybe show us a disappointing feelings and atmospheres in the U.S., especially the government officers. Maybe not. I'm not sure. I have to study about it more. Yeah. No, thank you for your comment, and I will definitely share the final reports with you in the future. 최하진 교수님께서도 너무 좋은 코멘트와 이렇게 질문들 주셨는데요.
And raised excellent questions.
저희 주사에 약간 보완이 필요한 부분들을
And I think you pointed out some items that need to be supplemented in our survey. And you said that explanation is needed in terms of the camps of these 5 countries. And I totally agree. So I'm usually in charge of the analysis of the findings, and also experts in these 5 countries are conducting analysis as well to look at the findings from the viewpoint of these overseas experts. So I'm not sure if I'm the right person to answer your question, but all I can say is that those were the research findings. With regards to policy implications, when I saw the research findings, I thought the most important implication is that when it comes to public diplomacy on peace and unification, how can we increase voluntary participation of the private sector and lower the lead of the government sector, public sector here. So we jokingly said this amongst ourselves that if the boy band BTS mentions about peace and unification on the Korean Peninsula, public diplomacy will be completed. There's nothing more that we would be able to we should do, because they will do all the work for us. It's just a joke, but then it's not really a joke.
추동할 수는 있지만 그것을
So yes, the government can drive private participation, but if the government grabs the rein and takes the lead, it no longer becomes that of the private sector. So we would have to be able to make use of the resources of the private sector like culture and sports, and that would have to be done voluntarily, and we would have to create a motivation for that. So we need to make more related attempts. And what I feel is unfortunate is that we should not focus on short-term achievements. We should look at this from a mid to long term and changes in the political landscape and and surrounding affairs and so on.
이런 것들이 더 필요하지 않는가라고 생각을 하고 그런 정책을 추진할 수
And that should be applied to our policy as well. So that's one important implication that was found in this survey. Thank you very much. So thank you, the two presenters, for your wonderful presentations and also answers. And I'm sure that the excellent remarks made by our discussants would further upgrade your studies. I hope you will take them into consideration. So we took a look at the peace process on the Korean Peninsula amid the conflict between U.S. and China, and also we took a look at the public diplomacy and peace and unification of South Korean government. Thank you so much, everyone, for your participation. And I think we were able to identify a lot of tasks and items that need to be improved and supplemented going forward. So with that, we would like to conclude the session hosted by the Korea Institute for National Unification. Thank you, everyone. And that concludes the session for Measures for International Cooperation to Realize Sustainable Peace on the Korean Peninsula, hosted by Korean Institute for National Unification. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, presenters, discussants, and also the participants.